Victor had awoken. He'd spent the last couple hours trying to sleep off all the damage he had sustained and general exhaustion from Undrentide and the past couple months in general. Both emotionally and physically, Victor was drained, and it would take several days at the least for him to properly recover. But at the very least, he would feel more whole. At least now he could focus enough to properly read all of the findings. An introduction to this place. Perhaps he could do a bit of digging around as well, since previously all he had done was essentially check for threats and then collapse. To begin with, the Journal of the Lich was something that seemed quite interesting. Though some of this had already been read, he would begin with "To the Would-Be Adventurer." The book reads, "If you are reading these lines that I have written, then I know that I have been killed and forced out of my estate. I leave you with the knowledge that I have prepared for this contingency. My lair is not safe for you, adventurer. You will find, even in my death, that you may not trust those that dwell here. I have sent word to allies in this place who will come for you. And the traps, ah yes, they're lovely, intricate, and deadly in design." The entry is signed, "Yours in death, Astenon the Lich." And now Victor had a name to place to the Shadow Lich. He vaguely recalled the name being mentioned by the talking rat familiar of Undrentide, but he had been far too busy to truly commit it to memory. Moving on the Shadow Planar references, something that would certainly pique Victor's interest. I have found there to be numerous sources on the Plane of Shadow, but I have also found entries on the Demi-Plane of Shadow. Although the sources are similar, I'm not sure they speak of the same place, leading to more confusion. The material on Gord is indeed the best reading of them all, but I have begun to suspect that his exploits were somewhat exaggerated. Victor isn't familiar with what's being referenced there. It's something that he'll hopefully be able to research while he's here. There's also the fact that the Shadow Lich stated no one could be trusted here, but the only two servants that had remained were the odd flying creature and the shadow that essentially acted as a glorified butler. It raised questions on if they had already left or they were watching him. However, the shadows had bowed to him and hadn't attacked him in his sleep, so perhaps for now at least he was safe. It might be referencing other shadows or Shadowvar that had left. After all, they had been serving the Shadow Lich when Victor had defeated them. He'd move on to the article on the Shadow Grave. The new predator that haunts the graveyard is powerful indeed. No longer can I expand my realm of influence in that direction. I do not know what evil brought that creature to this place, but it is one that I am not capable of tangling with. Yet. That doesn't bode very well. Victor, of course, had beaten the Shadow Lich, but it had been by a hair, and frankly, he was not quite in top physical condition just yet. His body was still strained, exhausted, and frankly in pain. And of course he would skip over the trapped article, moving on to a planar spell treatise. I've discovered that many of the spells I used on Prime no longer function here on the Plane of Shadows. I suspect this is because the Shadow Plane has no direct link to the Astral Plane, so spells that rely on the connection, such as Magic Missile and Mage Armor, cannot function. Other spells are simply more difficult to manifest, particularly to those unschooled in spellcraft. Fire and light do not function here as they did in Prime. Of course, some magics are more powerful in this place, those that deal with darkness or shadows, of course, and also summoning spells, which apparently reach into shadow stuff on the Prime for their creations. Interesting. Well, Victor was thankful that he was a wizard and not a sorcerer. Adjusting his arsenal on a whim such as this would be difficult for a sorcerer. Certainly they could memorize a fair degree of spells, but nothing to the quantity that a wizard could. If he could study a couple of the scrolls here, memorize them, he could alter his arsenal entirely. Perhaps he should have studied a bit more on negative energy. But for now, he would have to make do. This also explained why his staff hadn't really worked too well, nor had his book. Now, this left the painting and cabinet, which he had removed the traps of, but he had not unlocked. Blowing on the chimes, he'd hear both click. Thankfully, they appeared to be normal locks. And inside the painting, to his surprise, would be a shadow golem head. This strange metal piece is dark, cold to the touch, and in the shape of a humanoid head. It seems to absorb the light around it. It weighs a tremendous amount. What Victor is confused on, however, is why it is here. Why not in the workshop? Had he tried to create it and it had failed, so he separated it? It was very odd. As well as a very potent greater magic bag, something that he would very much appreciate. A key to the zoo, not that he intended to open it anytime soon. Some thieves' tools, an amulet of fire resistance. Under the direction of Druxus Rhyme, these amulets were created by the Red Wizards of Thay, and are sold in their enclaves across the realms. Cheap and easy to make, this magical protection from certain elements is a huge source of profit from the enclaves. It's actually a fair amount of fire resistance. He wouldn't switch out for what he has at the moment, but it's something to bear in mind as worthwhile. As well, there were several cold stones, very useful in the creation of potions and wands. A diamond and ruby, also very potent. He would leave the shadow golem head here for now. It was far too heavy to just lug around. Some bullets of smiting. These bullets are especially dense and weigh twice as much as ordinary specimens. When launched, they seem to accumulate even more mass on their way to the target, finally smashing into the unlucky victim with the force of a swung mace. Well, that's quite the potent little weapon there, isn't it? Unfortunately, Victor has no skill in slings. If he must fall back on a ranged weapon, it's always been a crossbow. And, as well, a robe of scintillating colors. It was a rather remarkable little piece of armor. It shone in the light like a rainbow. It was not to his taste, but it certainly had potent abilities. He could at least study it. The wearer can cause the robe of scintillating colors to become a shifting pattern of incredible hues, color after color cascading from the upper part of the robe to the hem in sparkling rainbows of dazzling light. The colors daze those near the wearer, conceal the wearer, and illuminate the surroundings. The first of such robes was said to have been made by a Haran Lyria worshipper named Persephonon? Persephonon. An unusual Haruan, Persephonon showed talent for sorcery rather than wizardry. This social stigma, combined with his pursuit of the Joybringer's path and his flamboyant personality, put Persephonon at odds with his contemporaries. Despite these obstacles, Persephonon was appointed captain of a sky ship. He made his robe as a tribute to Lyra, in order to paint rainbows across the sky as he flew. This undignified behavior ultimately lost Persephonon his captaincy, and later led to his exile from Halroa. Welcomed in Luiren by the less rigid halfling culture, Persephonon enjoyed a happy life, and copies of his robe have similarly enjoyed a favored place among the hen bards. Unlimited uses a day of any spell is quite impressive. And a 1 use a day as well is very potent. It's something that Victor can break down and study and possibly re-enchant using similar effects. Now, bookcase. Looks like a custom book. Dryad Symbiosis. Each dryad is mystically bound to a single enormous oak tree and must never stray far from it. Those that do, die. Scribbled in the margins of this treatise are notes, not as different as her prime subject. Vegetation is different here, so the oak may take on other forms, it seems. I fear the day when the Shadow, Dryad, and Umbral Banyan all meet. He's not quite certain what the Umbral Banyan is. Perhaps asking the Shadowvar that this Twilight Festival would answer that. But it sounds as though the Shadow Lich drug a Dryad and her tree into the Shadow Realm for experimentation. Perhaps in the zoo? Dryads were potent enemies, however. He wasn't sure if keeping such a powerful creature inside one's home was exactly the brightest idea. And then again, he had lost a Victor, and hadn't exactly had much foresight. It was possible, he supposed. The Neverwinter Wood. The First Age, Golden Age, Nether Age. This is the ages of Undrentide, I'd guess. Or perhaps Netheril as a whole civilization. Let's read the uninvolved one initially. The Neverwinter Wood. This hefty tome attempts a complete history of the Neverwinter Wood, but the crux of what is known is summed up in the following passage. While many a tale has suggested that there are dark forces that call the wood their home, there is yet no definite answer as to what truly hides within. Many a glade has a guardian force watching over it, but never one so malevolent as is supposedly in residence there. These woods have never been logged by men, for they are feared and shunned by locals, and even orc hordes alter their course around and never through, though usually only after suffering a goodly number of stubborn casualties. How very like orcs. Now, the series of 5 books, that I guess they're in order. Suppose that Victor will find out. The First Age. Just over 5,200 years ago, the land that is now the Anarok was lush and green, with plains, forests, rivers, and lakes. Several fishing villages along one of these lakes chose to ally for mutual protection and called their new country Netheril. Eventually, this young country drove off or eliminated its nearby enemies and turned to expanding its borders, which brought them into contact with elves. The elves taught the humans arcane magic, and the Nethries took to it with an amazing aptitude. Every citizen gained education in magic, and learned at least the basics of spellcasting. Those with the talent for magic, called arcanists, became a powerful political group, second only to the nobility, surpassing even the priest class. The people of this time of early magic and learning called it the First Age of Netheril, but the people's education was only beginning. Well, that certainly explained quite a bit. If the Nethrilian people, or the Nethries, Victor has seen it pronounced and spelt both ways at this point, had been essentially studying magic for over 5,200 years, that was a tremendous amount of dedication for an entire culture, an entire country, essentially, to pour into study of the arcane. And it was no wonder they had advanced so far. Hmm. Interesting, if nothing else. Moving on to the Golden Age. 1,600 years after Nethril's founding, enough arcanists were developing advanced magic that a new floating city lifted into the skies every year. On these cities, the common people eventually had less and less say in their government and were taxed and forced to wait on projects to further the experiments of the city's Archwizard founder. Some Archwizards used their cities as staging grounds against old rivals or even as forays into other dimensions, planes of existence for those that were less versed in extraplanar theorem. Everything on a floating city became secondary to its Archwizard's quest for knowledge and power, and dozens of enclaves wandered the skies above Nethril's loose borders. During the Golden Age, the Nethries began to take an interest in their land-dwelling neighbors. They taught arcane magic to barbarian tribes, helped tribes fight against orc hordes, and did other similar activities of benign intent. Unfortunately, many of these plans backfired, with rival tribes attacking their magic-using neighbors and arcanists slaughtered at the hands of devious orc tribes. Meanwhile, many interpersonal conflicts between rival Archwizards and acts of rebellion by the common people of Nethril, as well as many arcanists delving into necromancy to preserve their existence by becoming undead creatures, signaled the end of this age and the start of the last. Couple run-on sentences in there. Victor would be intrigued by this because it feels like they've skipped a book explaining the creation of the flying cities. Nonetheless, it was relatively easy to read with his previous understanding of Undertide, so he wasn't completely lost by any means. It was just odd. The fact that they actually were teaching the other cultures initially was surprising. Of course, every civilization tends to have its golden age, where they help one another and truly work as one, and then personal pride, greed, and hunger always signal the fall of that empire. He supposed even ancient arcanic masterful societies were subject to that. The Nether Age. 300 years after the founding of Nethril, an adventurer now known only as Finder discovered the ruin of an old non-humanoid civilization. Within the ruin, he found 100 scrolls made of flattened gold, each bearing keys to powerful magic, its learning, and its use. He bore these artifacts, which he named the Nether Scrolls for his homeland, back to Nethril, and shared them with the arcanists there, who made their contents available to all citizens. Once again, magical research skyrocketed, this time beyond what most mortal creatures believed could be possible. This period, called the Nether Age, resulted in the creation of many new kinds of magic items and innovative spells. During this time, the Nethries made contact with the dwarven kingdom of Delzone, and after several years of negotiations, they developed a profitable and peaceful trade between them. This gives a bit more of a peek. Non-humanoid, powerful, magical civilizations. Victor wasn't aware of any of such a thing, but it wasn't as though they didn't exist, he was sure. Non-humanoid, though, meant it was some form of aberration? The first thing that came to mind was slimes, but as far as he was aware, they were, well, not descended from any overly intelligent creations. It was something to look into for certain. Moving on to the Mythalar era, something that Victor had become intimately aware of and connected to. Perhaps the greatest invention ever to come out of Nethril was the Mythalar, a magic device that would forever change the way of life for all people of the Empire of Magic. First created 800 years after Nethril's founding, the Mythalar was a brightly glowing crystal 150 feet in diameter that served as a magical battery, drawing huge amounts of power and sending it outward to a radius of 1 mile. Within this radius, other magic items could draw on the Mythalar's power instead of having to tap into the source of magic directly, allowing the creators of these items to make them more quickly, efficiently, and cheaply. Suddenly, these quasi-magical items, which did not function away from the Mythalar, were as common as jewelry, and even the common people of Nethril had access to powerful and convenient magic that would make their lives easier. With less work to do, the Netherese turned to art and architecture to bring joy into their lives, creating flying sculptures of precious metals and strangely shaped, beautiful buildings held up by the sheer power of magic itself. The most important consequence of the creation of the Mythalar was the Flying City. The most powerful Netherese arcanists used magic to slice off a mountain peak, turn it over, and affix a Mythalar to the center of its flat side using the power of the Mythalar to hold the massive rock in the air. Wow. These arcanists then created buildings on these flying rocks, which became flying cities. Eventually, one could see over a dozen of them in the sky, and on a flying city, the arcanists that created it held absolute power. These flying cities, or enclaves, were the supreme manifestation of Nethril's power and glory. Victor is relatively speechless. The idea of a flying city is obviously quite far. Not far-fetched, but far as in the amount of time, effort, research, and power that it would take to maintain it is ridiculous. Obviously, the Netherese found a way to compensate for this. But the idea of slicing off a mountaintop, which is essentially bedrock, or material of equivalent density in nature, and then flipping it over without destroying it and keeping it aloft the entire time would take more magical ability than even some of those powerful witches in history have managed, especially for elongated time periods. The magical aptitude these arcanists had was absolutely breathtaking. It made Victor all the more annoyed that he'd not really gotten to study much of it. Hopefully, this laboratory would have a bit more information on the Netherese and allow Victor to dig into their knowledge a bit more. The Silver Age. With the great cities darkening the skies, the most powerful Netherese arcanists, the Arc-Wizards, began to fear that they would eventually crowd themselves out of existence. So there were so many of these mountain peaks that were flipped upside down that they began to fear overcrowding. That's absolutely amazing. Where was I? Out of existence, and decided that another wave of expansion was in order. Avoiding their sometime elven allies to the east and their constant battles with orc hordes to the north, they chose to expand westward into the land of the barbarian humans who did not practice arcane magic. The Netherese created several well-guarded outposts along their border with the barbarians, which would allow them to spy on their neighbors and protect trade caravans in that area. Because these outposts were not near a Mythalar, the Arcanists found themselves forced to develop powerful magical items that would work outside the influence of a Mythalar, and some of these powerful items still exist to this day. These outposts laid the foundation of what would be Nethral's greatest era. This seems like it was after the First Age, most likely, but that's fine.